What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to another terrarium update. Today we're going to take the 1 year and 2 month look at the bottle terrarium, the 11-month look at the jumbo terrarium, and the 7-month update on the no opening terrarium. Let's start out with the oldest terrarium of the 3, and that is the bottle terrarium. Of the 3 terrariums, there's probably the most to talk about this one, partially because you haven't seen it longer than the other ones, but also just because there's some interesting things going on in here. Unlike you typically see with my other terrariums, as we do the update on this terrarium, I'm actually not going to do any maintenance whatsoever. I'm just going to tell you what's going on in here, and we'll leave it be because there's some interesting things going on in here, and I think I just want to see how it progresses. That said, we'll start up front here with the Ficus pumila quercifolia, otherwise known as oak leaf creeping fig. With this plant, it's a vining plant. It's supposed to sort of create ground coverage and a dense carpet in most cases in a terrarium. Despite the fact that this plant really hasn't creeped around as intended, it does appear to be healthy overall. I see one leaf that has a little bit of yellowing in it, but that does happen with this plant from time to time. A few leaves, they might go yellow, die off, and then new growth will come. So I'm not really concerned about it at all. And the root structures seem to be pretty healthy on it. There's a lot of roots down in the base of the terrarium here, and I'm not sure if those are from the Ficus pumila, but they very well could be. Next, we'll take a look at the cryptanthus here. If I remember correctly, this is a Mars cryptanthus. I never actually said in the original video what type it was because I didn't know at the time, but whenever we added it to this terrarium, it was a fresh cryptanthus pup just separated from its mother. Now, it's interesting what has happened with this because it's clearly matured. The leaves are broader, and the plant, honestly, it looks like an adult cryptanthus. It's just super small, so it's kind of dwarfed out, which is probably a good thing since this terrarium isn't that big, and this cryptanthus alone would probably get the size of the jar. Now, whenever I had added it in here, I did add it knowing that it is a large plant, and I kind of wanted it to just fill in the space so you couldn't really see in here, but long term it's probably much better if this plant just remains a dwarf. Now, I don't know if that will affect its health long term, like if it will only live for a short amount of time because it's dwarfed, but it very well could last a long time as it is, possibly produce young. I don't know, we'll see what happens with it, but with this, it appears to be healthy. It looks like an adult plant, but it's just dwarfed out. And again, that could come down to environmental factors. There could be nutrient deficiencies in the substrate, maybe not enough light, or maybe not enough water. And those are all very well could be potential culprits to why this plant has dwarfed. But I don't really have any complaints with it because, again, I think it will actually be beneficial long term for this terrarium. Next up, we'll take a look at the Selaginella uncinata, or the rainbow spike moss. As you can see, it's pretty much taken hold of this terrarium. It's pretty much grown on the entire back side of the terrarium. This is actually the side that faces the window, so it's kind of growing up toward the light, and it's even rooted itself to the background. And it's kind of interesting because it's pulled the substrate up onto the background along with the roots. As this plant matures, it will get these sort of red and pink hues to it, which are really interesting, and that's actually why it's called the rainbow spike moss. It gets all these cool colors about it, sort of like a rainbow, and in this case, you'll see that it's mostly a pale green color, arguably white in some cases, and on most of the tips, it's this nice sort of light pink color. Now, it definitely should not be this light in color. Again, that probably comes down to environmental factors. It could have got sunburnt. I tend not to think that's what it was just because I haven't had any issues with that with my other terrariums, and they're all mostly on the same window, or the same window that this one is. And again, no issues with sunburn, so I don't think that's what it is. It could be nutrient deficiencies, or again, like the other plants, maybe not enough moisture. But the thing is it's still growing really well. The root structures look healthy, and it's continuing to grow. It's not like this all happened last year or within a few months and it hasn't grown since, I look at this terrarium pretty frequently and it's growing daily. Like it's definitely growing and growing and growing, and it would probably be beneficial to go in here and trim it up a little bit. But again, I think I'm just going to let this terrarium do its thing, and maybe at a later date we'll do a surprise update or a unscheduled update to do some maintenance on it. And finally, we have the Philodendron Silver. Of the plants that are in here, this one probably has me the most intrigued. Like the Cryptanthus, it is pretty much dwarfed out, which is probably a good thing because as this plant matures and grows large, the leaves could get at least half the size of this container here. And I put it in here knowing it would get that big, and my intent was to just allow for only small growth and then trim all the big leaves, pull them out. But this is actually probably easier for me, and as you can see, the plant has also turned this nice pink color. Now, that pink color might not be a good thing. It could be showing signs of phosphate deficiencies in the plant. That's typically why a plant would turn red or a pinkish color like this. But I actually like how it looks. I think it looks really nice. And we'll see long term if that actually affects the plant at all. Just like the other plants though, this is actually growing and appears to be thriving in this terrarium. You can see various new shoots that are starting to come up. There's definitely a lot of new leaves on here from whenever we originally put it in the terrarium. And there's a very vast root structure going on within this terrarium, and it's most likely from this plant. I don't really think any of the other plants, maybe the Cryptanthus, would create roots like this. The Selaginella, no doubt, would definitely not create roots like this. And it's got to be the Philodendron or the Cryptanthus that has these roots here. So something is definitely established in here and doing quite well. Another environmental factor that I didn't think to put into consideration is that I keep these terrariums on a window that has a pretty severe draft in the winter season. So I wonder if that coldness sort of stunted or affected the plants in any way. Being that these are tropical plants, they prefer a warmer climate and that sort of thing. So I think it's definitely something to put into consideration when critiquing or reviewing this terrarium. But overall, I do think it's doing well. I think it is going to last long term. It's just a matter of everything coming together, and obviously it is like the plants are acclimated to this environment. But I don't know. It's interesting. We'll see what happens to this terrarium long term though. Now on to the jumbo terrarium. Overall, I think this one is doing really well. All of the plants seem to be growing quite nicely. I actually think that we need to come in here and trim some things because they're outgrowing the container, and I believe that I also want to add another plant. So why don't we open this thing up and then we'll kind of talk about what's going on in here. So I've just got a little scraper here. I'm going to stick it in between the cork and the glass and just pry it open. And as tradition has it, whenever we open a terrarium here, we gotta give it a sniff. Yeah, it smells pretty good. It smells like the forest, and that's exactly what we want. That is the signs of a healthy terrarium. First order of business, I want to trim up some of this Syngonium podophyllum. As you can see, it's actually literally outgrowing the container here, and some of them are actually getting sort of wilting on the leaves, probably from being stuck up against the glass like this. And what I'm going to do, I got some wire cutters here. I'm just going to come towards the base of the plant and trim it off. With those few sections of the Syngonium removed, I just want to thin this out a little bit. As you can see, it's all just really growing up against the glass and it's not being productive. So what I'm going to do is, first thing is just remove any plants that are undesirable looking. So you see this leaf, it has again a little bruise or something on it, probably from being pressed up against the glass. I'll see if I can actually remove this one by hand. Yep, just like that. Pinch it, pull it off. Now that I got most of that thinned out, I'm just going to get a paper towel and clean off this side of the glass. There's a few dead leaves that are just kind of stuck to it, and excess condensation, so I'm just gonna, best I can, to gently Clean this off. So see how I kind of have this sludge on the paper towel here? That's what I'm wiping off the back of the glass here. And it wouldn't really hurt to leave it in there, but it's probably better off to get it out of there. Something that's kind of cool is all of the Java moss on the back side of the terrarium here. It's literally just growing up the glass. And I could get rid of it, but I actually think I'll leave it there. We'll see if it grows all the way to the top. And I don't know, I just think it might create an interesting look to allow that to grow in. As is, I like the terrarium, and when I originally designed it, I pretty much wanted it to be simple, just center focused in the back. But unfortunately, the Peperomia frazeri, it didn't really do what I wanted it to do. So I actually want to remove it. And replace it with a new plant, which is a Begonia Rex. Now this isn't going to grow nearly as large as the other plants that are in here, but I think that'll add a nice variation in texture and help break up the background and foreground a little bit. Alright, so I actually just think that this particular Begonia Rex isn't going to work in the terrarium, so I'm going to go put this back where I got it from. And we'll replace it with this one. This one's growing a little bit more upright, so I think it will work better in this terrarium. With this Begonia Rex added, I really like how it looks now. Not that I didn't like how it looked previously, but I think that it just needed a little bit of work. Whenever I originally made it, I really liked it, but as I looked at it some more, I'm like, yeah, maybe I should have done this or that, and yeah, so it's just like an ever-changing work of art. But since we've had this open for a little while, I'm just going to add a little bit of water down in here, and I'm mostly just going to spray the moss. So we'll just fold this piece of Syngonium down and press the cork back on for another 6 months or so. I don't know how long we decide to keep this thing closed before we do maintenance again. Alright, so after doing a little bit of maintenance, the jumbo terrarium is looking as good as ever. Now, a few things that happened in the past few months or so is you see up front here the Java moss is kind of yellowed a little bit. That seemed to happen whenever we kind of entered into winter. It was doing really well, growing mostly as you see on the back side of the terrarium, but I don't know if it dried up a little bit up here or if the cold somehow affected it, but the Java moss did not seem to like it. However, I would say in the past few weeks or so, it does seem to be bouncing back, so I suspect that by the next time that we do another update on this, it will have filled back in. Onto the other plant in the foreground, we've got the oak leaf creeping fig. It's doing really well. It's definitely been creeping around as it should, clinging onto a lot of the hardscape items such as the bark here and also this stone. So that's pretty cool. Moving on to the back side of the terrarium, of course, we have the Syngonium podophyllum, which we just trimmed up a bit. And we also have the Pilea spruciana, which it too is doing really well. It's grown significantly, both the leaves on the plant and also the stem of the plant. It's gotten much thicker and the leaves have grown to a pretty large size, so that's looking really neat. And whenever we look at it from the front, it does create a dense little patch, which I think looks really cool and helps separate the background from the foreground. However, as I said, I wanted to add this Begonia Rex to kind of diversify the look and help separate the background and the foreground. I think initially I didn't do the best job in separating it. I guess in a way it created tension, which made somewhat of a successful design, but I feel like it was lacking as I looked at it long term, and I think that adding the Begonia Rex was a nice touch. I just remembered that I also added a little bit of Slaginella to this terrarium. I think it was doing pretty well for a while, but it unfortunately has died off for the most part. There's a little section up front here which seems to be sprouting some new growth, so I suspect that within the next couple months or so that we're going to start to see some more of that in here. And finally, we have the Peperomia frazeri or frazeri, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And it's not doing bad at all. I mean, it's spreading out a little bit, especially in the background here. And it seems to be a nice little sort of accent plant in this terrarium, at least. I expected for it to grow a little bit larger than it is in here, but it's specific to its environment, I guess, because I have it in some enclosures it's growing pretty large, but in here it's kind of small. But I like the way that it looks. Overall, I really like how this terrarium looks, as always. However, I'm guessing that as we move forward with this, I may decide to add more plants down the road, but as it is currently, I like how it looks. So why don't we move on to the third and final terrarium. And last but not least, we have the No Opening Terrarium, and unfortunately, it just didn't make it. Now, there are a number of things that you may be thinking as to why this didn't work out. Maybe there was too much water in it. Maybe the plants I chose just weren't going to work in the terrarium. Maybe just the construction of it or the container is why it didn't work. And I can tell you that it's none of those things. Unfortunately, I decided to do something different with this terrarium as an experiment, and you might not have picked up in it when I said it in the video, but it proved to be a grave mistake, and here's what it was. However, altered this one slightly. I added a little bit of potting soil in it, organic potting soil. I'm just experimenting a little bit with this terrarium, so I figured I'd mix up the substrate as well. Yeah, I added this to my substrate mix, and as I always say, the substrate is highly important in the terrarium. I have been using the same blend for years. It's that one that I used on all my other terrariums, and it was the same in this terrarium. However, I decided to add a little bit of potting mix to it, and I have a strong feeling that that's what caused the issues in this terrarium. Now you may be wondering, how do I know that it was that potting soil that ruined this terrarium? Well, plain and simple, I didn't do anything differently with this terrarium than I normally would. I used the same substrate other than adding that. We got a false bottom. All of these plants that I used, they're tried and true. I've used them in plenty of other terrariums before with great success. And the water content appeared to be good. It was condensated at some periods of the day, pretty clear at other times, and it pretty much aligned with what I've done for years on terrariums. However, in this case, I did one thing slightly different, and that was I added the potting mix. So there's really only one way to prove this, and we're going to open it up here just for a second and give it a sniff, because I have a strong feeling that it's going to stink. Alright, so let's open this thing up. Oh, did you hear that? This thing's going to reek. That's gross. I gotta close that back up. That is gross. Hold on. I had to just get a third whiff, or whatever kind of whiff that was, just so I could describe the smell to you guys. So, have you been to your local barnyard lately and walked yourself in some sour manure while sniffing on some rotten milk or cheese? Well, that's exactly what this thing smelled like. It did not smell very pleasant, and unfortunately, I had to get a third whiff for you guys so that I could accurately describe the smell. But it wasn't pleasant. Hopefully, I didn't lose too many brain cells during the process. What it comes down to is, do not add this into your terrarium substrate. Now, I'm sure it has other practical applications, but I just do not think that it's practical for use in a terrarium. There's got to be something in here that just, as it's in a closed environment like this, it's just building up some type of toxicity that is not good for the plants. And as you heard, whenever I opened it, it just had that, like, there's some kind of just noxious gas building up in there that's no good. So that's all I gotta say about that. And there you have it, another terrarium update in the books. We of course have the No Opening Terrarium, which unfortunately didn't make it this time around because of the substrate. Don't add this into your terrarium substrate. I think in a few weeks, whenever we redo this, we're going to have great success with it, so stay tuned for that one. We also have the bottle terrarium, which on the other hand is doing quite well. In my opinion at least, I think that long term it's going to do really well. We just got to see how it's going to progress in the next few months. I suspect that in the summertime we're going to see a lot of new growth, see a change in some of the plants, and overall I suspect good things from this terrarium. And finally, we have the Jumbo Terrarium, which is doing really well. Of the plants seem to be growing quite nicely. The oak leaf creeping fig is attaching onto everything and creeping throughout the terrarium. Overall, the moss is doing pretty well, other than a little bit up in the front. And of course, the Syngonium and Pilea are doing really well. And then we added this nice new Begonia Rex. But being a jumbo terrarium, I think I may have named it incorrectly because it's not so jumbo anymore. And now maybe you get a better idea as to why I said that, introducing the next generation. And that's about all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate you and I thank you for watching. If you want to see future updates on all of the terrariums that you just saw to see how they progress in the future, definitely hit subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want to see what I'm going to do with those enormous jars that you just saw sitting in front of me, definitely subscribe and stay tuned for that as well. And that's it. I'll see you guys later. Peace.